right, this is Craig Herndon. I'm here at the PTC headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts, in the Seaport. It's actually a really awesome view. Got 16 floors, and you can see the whole harbor from here. So if you haven't had a chance to get to check it out, definitely come out here and see it. And I'm here today with Valentin Heun. So he is the director of the PTC Reality Lab. Valentin, welcome.
Hello.
So Valentin, why don't you kind of go into your background before you came here at PTC and Reality Lab. So go into kind of what you did at MIT and anything else you want to fill in.
Okay. I think the interesting point about my background for all of the stuff that I do here is that originally I come from a graphic design background, visual communication. From there, somehow, writing code was a hobby of mine for my whole life. So I ended up at a media lab at MIT.
What languages?
All kinds. I think that's not so relevant. I think what's relevant is that I ended up in a place that describes itself as, if you don't know where else you should go, then you're probably right here. So like a place for misfits. And in the media lab, I think there's a common foundation. You have all kinds of discipline, but the common foundation is that anyone knows how to speak code in some way, and so that's where I basically spent 6 years before I went to PTC. And the interesting point is that in that media lab, I looked at all kinds of different direction of technologies, always with the background of human-computer interaction. And eventually, my previous background in design collided with all of the interest in the media lab. And that is the sweet spot for augmented reality. So augmented reality is an interesting discipline that has to do with human-computer interaction or human-machine interaction. But you can only solve it from a graphic design background because it's a pure graphical problem.
So seeing it like as a graphical problem, isn't there also like the human perception and interaction problem that comes with it?
Yeah, exactly. That is graphic design is a human perception problem at itself.
Right.
You always ask yourself, how do people see something? How do people perceive it? What is the message that I curate or that I basically program into my work? And that's the same thing with augmented reality, and that's actually the same thing with every kind of graphical user interface, for example, the desktop that we have. And so for the last 5 years, I think I'm trying to attack the model of the desktop computer a little bit, because we started to build this really powerful computer that makes us think about the world as a desktop surface. And then we have our phones that basically is the same thing in a slightly different format, but still a desktop. And now we try to desktopify the world around us. We try to put the factory in the form of a desktop, and that creates problems. And these problems lead us to train people for years to make that into their new reality, and try to give somebody the knowledge to operate a factory through a desktop interface. And that itself requires years of training.
So would Windchill be an example of one of those, like just one of the many ways that PTC has desktopified running a factory?
It's not particular. I don't think you can say PTC has put something in a desktop. I think the thing is that we, as technologists in general, the entire world uses desktop computers. So every kind of software that you use right now is seen through the desktop. That's there's every other company out there does that. And the interesting thing what happens here in PTC is that PTC sees that and sees the potential in augmented reality how, like, Jim Happelman uses the analogy of a modem for the brain, basically to put more data throughput into your brain. And I think that's a really interesting analogy. And how to look at it is also, we have like processing units in our mind to put that data throughput into our brain. And one of these processing units is spatial learning. We actually have a superpower in our mind that is particular meant for spatial learning. And a desktop computer has nothing to do with space. That's a desktop. And but augmented reality is actually a truly spatial technology. So you put the data where it is. If you walk through a factory, you put the data in space at the machines where they are, and you as a human you are able to interact with that information much more intuitive than through a desktop. And that is something that PTC sees. And that is something that PTC is looking at. So I think this company is so way ahead compared to many, many other companies who are in that kind of space. That's the reason why I'm here.
I think it would be a good segue. And at what point, like, were you brought in? And what was that conversation? And like, hey, we're starting this new reality lab, and like, this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. I don't 100% know what was first, the idea to bring us in or to build the reality lab. I think these two things go a little bit hand in hand. And I think they have to do with the media lab as well. So when I was a student there, I got more and more contact with the higher management in PTC. And on some point, I was sitting in a conference room in Needham in front of Jim Happelman, and we were discussing augmented reality, the work that we did, the work that PTC is doing. And I first wasn't so interested in working for PTC. I had my mind in many other directions. But then I realized how spot on Jim Happelman understands what we're dealing with and where we're going. And there is no other company in the entire industry that has a CEO that understands so spot on what augmented reality is about. And that was an interesting point. So we talked about how we can put our ideas together, and somewhere in the process, I think that lab came to existence. Probably he had this idea for the lab before, and that's why he started talking with me.
Awesome. Well, it's pretty awesome that you're here. So now that you are here, what are some of the examples that like you started working on when you first got here? And then I guess like what are you working on now on top of that? But let's go ahead and start with like what were some of the first things you started working on when you got here?
I think what was really interesting was one of the first ideas. When you look at the industrial machine, you see a lot of HMIs, human machine interfaces, like 2D screens with buttons on them. And they are like, when you look at augmented reality, there's basically virtual buttons in space, maybe. But you can also have a screen that has physical buttons. It's just virtualizing something that can be already there. And for us, that was a really interesting intersection. It's like, can we make something that is virtual physical? Can we make something that's physical virtual? Can we make a transition between these two spaces extremely seamlessly so that it totally dissolves the two worlds? So that's something that we started to work in the beginning. And so we built a technology where you can take user interface elements off a screen and place in AR, or from AR back into the screen, and create this really seamless transition, because there's really no reason that these two things need to be separated.
People haven't seen the video where you can just go in, like grabbing it out of the screen and take it over to the 3D printer and then print that object.
Yeah.
Almost as if like you're grabbing a physical item and putting it in the printer.
Yeah.
And it just clicks right away that this is how it works. Because for me, printers are the bane of my existence. Like always fighting with them. But when it's something like that simple, I think it really shows the power of that like spatial thinking.
Yeah, and there's a very powerful idea hidden in there because one of the first demos I built ever was a little radio that that only had a volume button and a tuning knob, and it did not require anything else because it had augmented user interface on top where you could create MP3 playlists and selections and so on. And what happens here is that because you provide a virtual layer onto a physical thing, the physical thing changes its functionality or the required functionality, and it can change its physical shape. It can be extremely simple because now it has a digital layer on top. So when we think about augmented reality, we shouldn't think about there's a concept about a mirror world. Wired wrote about it, where you say there's just another layer on top of the world, but the world stays the same, and there's just another layer. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's happening is that once you build an augmented reality layer, that has profound impact on how the world actually looks like. So the world will change in their appearance, and these things totally collide and merge together. And so in the end, it doesn't matter if something is physical or virtual, or there's like these things will merge. And I think this example is a good example where we can take stuff out of a screen and put it in AR. Or you have a radio that suddenly only has a few buttons because the rest is virtual.
Yeah, Charlie Fink would call it the convergence. Is actually what his book about, is like how all these things are kind of melding together, and like we're not going to have separate apps every time we want to do an AR thing. It's just going to be, coming from AR Cloud. It's going to be powered by 5G, and like you'll just be able to do through web XR, which is just going in your browser and it works.
Yeah, that's just a technological layer. I think what's interesting is really the affordances of the world around us, how that changes. Once we, like, for example, the smartphones that we have already make super strong impacts on the world around us. As an experiment, I've been in Berlin. I have some friends there, and I had no SIM card with me that I could access the internet or do a phone call. And I tried to visit a friend, and there's no doorbell anymore because people are used to send text messages. I could not visit that friend because I didn't know how to communicate with him.
Wow.
And that's already a change just with the technologies we already have, a change on how the world around us looks like. So now, put that forward with augmented reality around us, it will entirely change how the physical world around us will look like through that lens that we have.
I see. Yeah. So if, let's say, a virtual UI starts replacing some of the physical items, like will we still have light switches? Will door handles really be there, or will there be some other way to interact with it and open it? So I know, like when the stock market started to become more and more electronic, there's argument that these algorithms are literally changing the landscape because they're blowing up like mountains to make way for like broadband cables to bring them through. So it's definitely not entirely new precedent that the physical world is being changed by the digital. But I think in this way, it's much more close to home. Because it's things that people interact with every day.
The interesting thing is when you say that the internet, moved mountains and buildings in New York are suddenly not for humans anymore. There are just tons of machines in there because they're closer to some other node. The interesting with augmented reality is that instead of making our world a little bit more foreign to us because of machines that take place in there, it's the one technology that does the opposite. It actually makes the world that we have created with the technology around us more accessible to us. So it actually makes it easier and more intuitive for us to operate.
So kind of bringing it back to like what's going on in the lab. So what are some of the other demos that like you've shown at AWE and most recently LiveWorks of just, if you just want to go into any one of the examples. So one that comes to mind for me would be the remote control where you have like a pad of this robot And so now you can tell it to like go pick up an item and then just tap like on the 2D layer of like your factory floor, like what you want it to do. I want it to go here and then come back over here. And then so I can then have to repair this part without telling a human to go do it.
That's actually a normal version how you would program the robot right now, but we did something different.
I see.
In our case, what you can do, you can physically walk through a space and then point with a phone at the points on the floor in that space where the robot should walk.
Awesome.
So instead of remotely looking at a desktop again, you actually are in the space and you're able to spatially tell the robot really where to go, the way you would point a person to, go from A to B or something. Yeah. The interesting thing with all of these demos is augmented reality is so visual that it's extremely difficult to tell through a voice what it's doing. So I would encourage everyone to just look up our webpage and see our demos.
We'll have links to some of the demos in the show notes, so people can actually go and check these out. So just trying to imagine, because you haven't seen it before, it's kind of mind blowing. So like another one of them would be where you can go through and like physically make like either like a check pattern for software or like doing remote assistance. But we can physically go in and then be like, all right, step 1 here, and now it goes over here as step 2, and then the next person that does it can come in and be guided by that to be able to do the process.
That's actually a real product that we have. That's the expert capture product. It's not something we're doing in the lab.
Oh, okay, got it.
So you see how advanced we are.
Yeah.
You think it's a research project, but it's actually a product in the market.
Nice. That's awesome.
I think another thing that we are working on that's really strong is we call it it's a remote. Okay, how we for the so we there is this work that we call the reality zone, and whatever is in the zone is virtually recorded like with a volumetric video. So we think about this. You have a digital twin of a machine, and a digital twin was generated one time, sometimes in the past, and updated, I don't know, once a month or so on. So what we try to do is to get a digital twin or a proxy of a physical item 30 times per second generated, like a full 3D model of a space, 30 times per second. And that model we can send to somebody else in the world, and then remotely you will be able to operate the machine or talk to people that are in that zone, because you have the ability to co-locate yourself the same way you would be actually on the spot in that space. And that is another application that augmented reality can lend itself to really allow you to co-locate yourself and be there while being remote.
And coming back to this idea of convergence and the technologies that you're working with. So you have like the AR part of it. So I don't know if you're working with like the HoloLens as well, but you have that component. But then for all these items that you're working with, there's the IoT piece of it, where now you're merging AR and IoT. Can you kind of go into like how you're leveraging that?
Yeah.
Into how we change our interaction.
I think actually the reality editor was one of the first demos that showed the potential of IoT and AR combined. We did that 7 years ago or so. Actually 8 years by now. And the interesting thing is that with augmented reality alone has no value. It's the same thing with a screen without a computer and the internet. It doesn't really make any fun. Only if you have the internet, you can chat with other people. So augmented reality itself is very boring. You have to combine it with something else. And IoT is an extreme, or let's say IoT is a technology where you let other machines talk with each other. But as a human, it's very difficult to take part in that conversation.
And understand or interpret.
Yes. And augmented reality is that technology that allows you to take part in that communication among these machines. So it's extremely powerful for that purpose.
Right. and you can also like visualize it. So if I want to know like what is this machine communicating with, now I have visualization where maybe it's even showing the lines to like which machine it's communicating with.
Yeah. So the reason why it is so difficult for us to talk with machines that talk with each other, that's basically IoT, is machines are in space and the data is spatial, and the machine for to talk with another machine doesn't need a spatial model for that. It needs it can use any kind of abstract model to talk with another machine. But we humans need a spatial model to understand that data. And again, when we look at the data through a desktop, we have some abstraction that somebody invented, but it's really hard to push that data into our brain, to use that modem analogy again.
Yep.
But once you put the data actually where it's generated, you put it in the space and you see how machines are connected through space with each other, it becomes child's play. It's super easy to understand. So that is the real potential of augmented reality combined with IoT.
And looking more in the future, are there any products right now that you don't feel like will hit the market for like another 5-10 years? Like what technologically is holding us back from reaching that greater potential?
Oh, I think so. It's so interesting. Probably, I mean, you always see these talks of other technologists who have some. I saw the talk from what is his name? Some of the inventors from Siri. They worked at a research lab where they did all kinds of that stuff, and he thought, "Oh, this is a quick little problem." And then, 15 years later, he's like, we put a couple of our technologies together and like the proof of concept, not even the most advanced one. And then Apple bought it and called it Siri. And he's still working on that stuff. And the problem from a technologist perspective is that you have all of these ideas and you can solve them. The only problem that you have is time and resources. But then there's also the society component and the infrastructure component. And from augmented reality perspective, we are very much in the beginning, and we're probably going to be at the beginning for the next 5 years or 6 years, because we don't have yet the infrastructure to really put that vision into the world. We have the infrastructure to put it in a factory, but not into the world. And even if we have that infrastructure, we still need to educate people to make use of it.
Right now, people are most comfortable interacting with AR, like with their phone, as opposed to putting something on their head. And it's like easing them into like a very cold pool or something, right? You have this ocean of AR, and right now you're just being like, just put your feet in this water and see how it feels.
I don't think really that it's a big. It's not a question between a head-mounted display and a phone. Both of them serve very good purposes. I think you really need to hit the use cases that have a big pain point right now to create the will of make use of infrastructure or to implement new infrastructure. So. Also, I think there's a technology perspective from the AR community. So, for example, we now know how to put content in spaces, and we now know how to understand spaces from the technology perspective. But we don't have technology yet where we could reproduce something like the internet. We are not able to co-locate the applications from a PTC and the applications from another company next to each other, even interacting with each other maybe. So we're missing kind of an operation system layer for the world, like a playground where everyone can put their stuff out, Like the internet makes it really easy. You put a machine somewhere connected to the internet and now
any other machine
reserve a URL, and there you are, It can cost you $5 to do that. but we don't have infrastructure like that for augmented reality right now.
Okay. And would you say the AR cloud is that infrastructure is being built out?
I think it is a starting point, definitely. But you see, the internet is not just one cloud. It has many clouds that operate in the internet. So there, from my perspective, to really, I mean, this is like, I don't know, 10 years into the future or something.
Yep.
I think there needs to be like there needs to be something like the internet itself in which everyone can drive in.
Yep. Yeah, it's just exciting to kind of sit here, seeing a lot of these potentials, and going to meetups and events. You see a lot of really cool ideas, and just even in the past 5 years, it's been cool to see a lot of those ideas come to fruition and become products. Yeah. But I think this long-term vision that Jim Heppelman was able to see of all this potential, and kind of see it slowly come to life, and kind of see like what is it going to be. I mean, when you plant a tree, you don't really know what that tree is going to look like when it's done. And I think we're at the point where it's just starting to come out of the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, I think at this point, it's pretty clear what are the most potential use cases at this point in time. And it's clear what is missing and where it can go. And then it's clear what can be happening then. And I think it's actually this kind of thing where you start a little project and you think it maybe takes you 2 or 3 years. Here we're already 7, 8 years later, and it's probably going to be another 10 years until some of these ideas get implemented. There's an interesting thing when I walked over the AWE conference is their theme this year was all about spatial. But you don't see any spatial. You see AR applications that have somehow to do with space, but they all do their little separated thing. You cannot just walk through the space and experience everyone's demos. Wouldn't that be amazing?
You're right.
So, and actually the reality editor that we built has this ability. So I did a workshop with some students. There were 5, 6 different groups. They all were building their own applications, and in the end, when we demoed, we just walked through the space, and we could, with one phone, we could just browse through all of their applications. They've never collaborated. There were 5 different teams, totally independent. But because the editor at its core is a browsing tool that allows you to see the content from different origins, we have that technology. So basically everything that you want to roll out for the next 10 years, we have that. It's just needs the right time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think of it as, what if you could just walk around and experience AR as you saw fit? So if you're just walking down the street, there might be like some information on some of the statues that are around you or things like that. But then you might also be seeing some cool demos outside of like the kinds of things that PTC is doing while you walk past their office. But so what's interesting to me is kind of some of the implications of, but what if I don't want to see it? Like and these are problems that the industry as a whole is just going to have to tackle in the future, of like, how do people decide not to view something? Once we make it to where it's seamless, where you're not downloading an app, you're not having to go to a website, you're interacting with it on site at the moment. And that's going to require a lot of context. And I think IoT is going to be a key part of that, as well as like GPS and those kinds of things. Because computing is going to need a whole lot more information about what we are, what we're trying to do, and like what we're saying, being able to show us the relevant augmented reality experience.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about it that right now, when you build a web page in the internet, you put a reasonable time into it with the expectation that in the end, millions of people will visit that one domain and experience your company's software. With augmented reality, it's kind of like the other way around. You might have a few visitors on that spot because it's physically there will not be a million people interacting with that experience. So you have to build something that is driven by these users. I think that's one perspective.
Interesting. And maybe even modular, to where you could relocate it and have it in multiple spots.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think those are some really cool things. So let's kind of tie it up and kind of bring it back to the Reality Lab. So the last question I have is, are there any partners you're allowed to talk about? Or if people do want to partner with either the Reality Lab or PTC, what are some of the channels they can go through to do that?
Well, we have an awesome email address that's called awesome@ptc.com. And you can send us an email there. And we are a little bit very selective where we get involved with. We have a very strong agenda already for the kind of work that we're working on. But of course, everything can collide with that agenda. And if something changes our perspective, then we have no problem throwing away our old thoughts and start something new. That's the purpose of a research lab. So yeah, check out our work, and if you find some interest in it, get in touch with us.
Yeah, so I just want to thank you for coming on the show and giving your insights. And it's just, I think it was one of the benefits of the show is being able to bring people like you on to share their expertise and insights into not only what's going on now, what's happened in the past, and kind of what's going forward. And I just want to thank you for bringing your insights to the show. All right. This has been another episode of the Virtuality Podcast. We'll see you in this reality.
And the next.
Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, virtuality.show.